The first thing I want to say is in relation to this bill is that it's coming hot on the heels of the budget. And the budget last week was described to me by constituents as being, the worst kind of a Christmas present that they could have got. People are facing into very, very difficult circumstances with a whole plethora of costs and a whole plethora of cuts as well in the budget. And the liability date for this new bill comes on the 1st of January, New Year. And, if that was about Christmas present, this is really going to be a very disappointing New Year for people. So the first thing I want to do is to have it recorded that to introduce a bill of this nature and force it through by tomorrow, I think is clearly undemocratic. The bill would more appropriately be entitled the Bank Bailout Bill. The bill has little to do with raising finance for local authorities and has more to do with bailing out banks and unguaranteed bondholders. And I'll explain why in a minute. To put it in perspective, the government has slashed the local government fund by a massive 84% and expects the public to come up with 160 million to fund services at local government level. This makes no economic sense. It's both political and economic piracy. This cut will bankrupt local authorities. Councils are struggling to fund their services. In recent years, councils under pressure from the commercial sector have had to reduce their commercial rates, and this naturally has had a negative effect on the funds raised. Here in Dublin, the largest local authority in the country has been forced to sell off its waste collection services, and this is despite having no proper national legislation to regulate the industry or to protect the public from unscrupulous waste collection companies. The sale was done in Dublin City Council so as it could raise funds to keep functioning. This unilateral decision by the management was made despite the democratic wishes of the elected councillors. In fact, on 3 separate occasions, a majority of Dublin City councillors supported the Sinn Féin motion opposing the sell-off of this essential service. So it's ironic that this motion that received Labour councillors' support at Dublin City Council, yet here in this House, the Labour Party and government are involved in an unprecedented attack on local government. We here in Sinn Féin, these benches, we believe in local government. Despite all our shortcomings, we believe that should be improved. And we believe in strong, democratic and accountable local government, Minister. Local government is strengthened when it has the funds and its councillors can make real decisions and are held accountable by the public for the decisions to make. But this bill does none of that. In fact, it fails to deal with the democratic deficit in local government. And if this bill is passed, it will make local government financially weaker and public services undermined and overstretched. We also believe that cutbacks need to be made. We know savings have to be made. But this bill takes the age-old lazy option of introducing a regressive flat tax on households. Thatcher, I think, called it poll tax. If we're to address the cutbacks and the waste, let's start at the top. Let's start and make those who can afford to pay the cost. And a quick look at the pay scales of city and county managers would clearly highlight where the real cuts should be made to local government. Top of the league is Dublin City Manager on 189,000. Then we have Cork Manager and Fingal County Manager and South Dublin County Manager, all on 162,000. Not far behind are the managers of Cork City, Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown on 154,000. And then in Limerick City Manager earns 142,000, while Waterford and Galway managers can expect to earn 132,000. And bear in mind, all of these managers will be paying the same household charge as someone on a new disability allowance after being cut last week. The bill is a desperate attempt by the government to shift money from local government into the banks. Local government must be financed by a progressive taxation system and having a progressive rate system. And we would argue for changes in the rate system. We've argued that there should be an income-based clause there for businesses. The bill here exposes the myth that we live in a low-tax economy. For years, consecutive governments promoted the idea that we somehow lived in a low-tax economy. And this mantra is used every time charges are introduced for healthcare, education, public services, including water and bin charges. Various government ministers and allies over the years have told us that to keep taxes down you just have to pay more. Most definitely a contradiction. And now here again in this recent budget, the Fine Gael and Labour government are telling us we must keep taxes down, therefore we must get the we must get the public to pay for services that they're already being paying for in those taxes. The public are being asked to pay €100 to local government. Who are being asked to pay that will be paying the same tax next month in income tax that they paid in the previous month. No reduction in taxes, just more hard-earned money being spent on essential services. But of course the rank and file, the rank hypocrisy of all of this doesn't stop there, Corley. When you study the detail of the bill, it becomes clearer. The person in a bedsit, if somebody has a bedsit behind their house, has similar to what a granny flat will be, as outlined in section 2, they will pay the same rate as somebody in a €5 million mansion. Where's the sense and the justice in all of that? Unless, of course, you're sitting on the government benches and you want people who are in bedsits who are on the bedsit to pay the same for local government services. Sinn Féin, as part of its budget proposals, proposed a wealth tax, and in regard to residential properties, this would apply to houses only worth over €1.2 million. Now, surely that's a bit fairer. The Minister has claimed that this is a temporary measure until they can bring in a more progressive property tax. And we would welcome this debate, a real debate about funding for local government, based on progressive politics. But this bill, and if you look in the bill, there's no commitment to introducing a temporary charge, or that has been brought in on a temporary basis. Corley, I can tell you now that this will be our first amendment to the bill. We want to see it in black and white, the commitment that this bill will be temporary, and the sooner this bill is history, the better. There's no attempt to conceal the government's contempt for ordinary people. Nowhere in the bill does it allow for a waiver for those on social welfare. And I heard a list of waivers being called out by the Minister in his speech and didn't address any of those issues. Last Tuesday, this heartless government cut €88 off disability allowance for young people, reduced fuel allowance for everyone, including the elderly. And this week now the government are asking people to stump up another €100 for local services. The bill will then attempt to criminalise you for not being able to pay. The bill states, quote, that where a person is convicted of an offence under the Act, the court shall order the person to pay the relevant local authority costs and expenses measured by the court incurred by the relevant local authority, unquote. So in other words, for a person who cannot afford the household charge, you will be brought to court, and if found guilty, you'll have to pay the court costs of the local council that brought you to court. And fines of up to €2,500. And I'm surprised to hear the Minister here saying, there's a normal thing in this country where deaths die with people, where people don't bring their deaths along with them in the coffin. And what's happening here is you're going to follow people to the grave, and after the grave you're going to follow their estate for this. It's absolutely outrageous that you're chasing people to the graveyards for them. Every page in this bill attempts to punish ordinary people for the mistakes that they're making. The charge comes in the same week that the government are trying to force through the Water Services Bill. Now, this was written before the announcement. I just heard it about 2 hours ago that you're going to hold back on that till after Christmas on the septic tank bill. Whereby householders yet again are being asked to bail out the government for the sins of consecutive governments. Town halls and communities the length and breadth of the country have been filled with ordinary people voicing their objections to the septic tank bill, including in Kerry last Friday night. But now these people are being hit with a household charge as well. But have no fear, Corley. There is a level of anger towards these charges that is palpable. People are being hit day after day with extra charges with no extra services. People who worked hard, and people who paid their taxes, and people who paid taxes 60% and higher in bad times, to ensure that service is provided. Now these same people are being asked to dig deeper and to pay extra for the same services that they have been receiving. So in people's minds, this doesn't add up, Corley. People know when they're being taken for a ride. They know when they're being punished for others. And Sinn Féin will campaign every step of the way against this regressive charge and make sure that it's overturned. We'll use every opportunity during the debates this week and into next year to ensure that this charge is reduced to the dustbin of history. How dare the government suck the oxygen of funding out of local government and then expect the ordinary people to breathe the oxygen back in? People, I believe, will simply not pay. The household charge will not be paid because people cannot afford it, and because it's basically very unjust, and to see that it is, and it should be withdrawn before it brings this government into conflict with its own communities. Regardless of this debate here tonight, People have already made up their minds. There's a line in the sand which they won't cross. Households will not be paying this charge, and the government can make every threat they want in this bill. They can threaten courts, fines and extra escalating costs, but people simply will withhold payment, I believe. Yet the government is dependent on 100% payment to compensate for the 84% cut in that part of the contribution of the local government fund. The cut in the local government fund is 165 million, and you earmarking, Minister, 160 million to be brought in by this bill, to be brought in by this charge, to make up the shortfall. I don't believe that this is going to happen. I believe this is an exercise in self-delusion. It simply will not happen. So, Ciancórla, where will the balance come from? If you do the maths, if there's a 90% if there's 90% non-payment, we'll have the ridiculous situation where we'll have the Minister trying to divide up 16 million between all of the local authorities in this state. Even if there's a 50%, if there's a 50% of the population who don't pay, this will reduce that part of the grant, by 80 million between the local authorities. Local authorities need the local government grant in 2012. Even with the best will in the world, this charge will not compensate for the cut made by this government. When the bin charges were first introduced, we opposed them, and we said that at the time that the charges were the first step towards the privatisation of domestic waste collection, and we were right. And tonight we predict that if this bill goes through, it will be the thin end of a very thick wedge. Households will first of all be forced to pay the €100, and then the costs will increase over time to maybe 500, 600, 700 euros. We don't know. So in conclusion, Ciancórla, at best the bill is ill thought out. It's a blunt instrument to punish households again. And it's another measure to force householders to make up the shortfall in the funding, in the state funding, where you have funding sucked out to pay the interest on bank debts. You know, at worst, it's an attempt to use the current economic crisis as a smokescreen to further bury local democracy in this state. Either way, we'll be leading the opposition against it.